Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for what promises to be a wonderful lecture that we're all looking forward to. My name is Elizabeth Hope, and I'm the Curator of Books here at AAS. And we are thrilled to have all of you joining us for this evening's lecture. Professor Sinha has graciously agreed to answer questions at the conclusion of her talk, so we'll look forward to that conversation. And she will also be available to sign copies of her book, The Slave's Cause, which are available in the corner there for sale. So the conversation can continue after her talk. But before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I'd like to just give a quick introduction to the American Antiquarian Society for any of you who may not have been here before. The American Antiquarian Society is a research library and learned society that supports the study of early American history and culture. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and then make available at least one copy of everything printed in what became the United States through the year 1876 and later in select areas. We also collect manuscript material on a more limited basis, as well as early printing from Canada and the Caribbean. I am happy to report that thus far, in over 200 years of collecting, the Society has gathered approximately 4 million items behind those doors over there, that they're now safely stored and available to researchers. Back there we hold 2/3 of everything printed in this country before 1820, which is a pretty remarkable statistic, and the best collection in the world of such material. Also of note are 2 million individual newspaper issues telling the stories of small and large towns across America. We have famous first editions, but we also have railway guidebooks and lottery tickets and cheap, trashy novels. So there's something for everyone in our collections. Prominent scholars come from around the world to use these collections, and in this very room, normally we have tables in here. But we are also open Monday through Friday, free of charge, to anyone whose research project would benefit from our collections, whether it be a college paper, or a family genealogy, or a local history. If you don't have a research project, but are just curious to see what's behind the doors, we also do have free public tours Wednesday afternoons at 3 p.m., so you can come back tomorrow then, and we'll give you a tour behind the scenes in the building. If you're interested in what we do here, please consider that AAS is an independent, nonprofit organization that relies on the generosity of our donors for our existence. We would be honored to have you partner with us in our mission, whether it be through donating collection material, and I had 3 people stop by my office today to donate books, or through sending a check or contributing online, or even leaving a donation in the donation box on your way out tonight. Your support in every way is what keeps us a vital organization, and we thank you. But now to the woman of the hour, the woman we're all here to see. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair of Early American History at the University of Connecticut. Professor Sinha's research interests lie in early United States history, especially in the transnational histories of slavery and abolition, and the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. She has published numerous articles and lectured widely on these topics, so I'm going to give you the highlights. We would be here for a while if I went through everything. Professor Sinha was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she taught for over 20 years, and there Professor Sinha was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed on faculty, and received the Distinguished Graduate Mentor Award in recognition of outstanding graduate teaching and advising. And I know some of her students are here today. Her first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum, South Carolina, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2000, was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015. Her most recent book, the one we're here to hear more about today, The Slave's Cause, The History of Abolition, from Yale University Press in 2016, was featured as the editor's choice of the New York Times Book Review. It was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and received the Avery Craven Prize in Civil War History from the Organization of American Historians. It was also named Book of the Year by the Times Higher Education in May to coincide with its UK publication. Professor Sinha is a co-editor and contributor to numerous volumes and is on the editorial board of the Journal of the Civil War Era. She's written for a few publications you may have heard of, including the New York Times, the New York Daily News, Times, CNN, Boston Globe, Huffington Post, and she's been interviewed by the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, Times of London, Boston Globe, and Slate. She was an advisor and on-screen expert for the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, The Abolitionists, in 2013, which is part of the NEH-funded Creative Equal film series. Sinha had an NEH-funded fellowship at AAS in 2004 to 5, and she was elected to membership in the American Antiquarian Society in 2006. On a personal note, Manisha has always been a delight to have in our reading room here at AAS, and I had to tell you one little anecdote. My husband and I were watching The Daily Show one night in 2014, and who should appear on the show but Professor Sinha? And I was able to say to him, I know her. So thank you for making my husband think that my job is cool, and I look forward to hearing from him.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that very generous introduction. I'll have to live up to it now. But I'm really happy to be here, and I thank everyone at the American Antiquarian Society for having me here today. Jim Moran, who arranged this lecture, and of course all the staff over the years who have supported my endless demands for newspapers and pamphlets and books, etc. It's really nice to be back here. You know, this is where the book began 10 years ago, and it's kind of nice to come back here where it all started. So in my talk today, this is a fairly large book, you'll see, though I hear it's readable. But I'm going to concentrate on just one aspect of the book, and that is the significance of slave resistance in the making of American abolition. I talk about the women's rights movement, the international movements that abolition overlapped with, like pacifism or utopian socialism, revolutionary republicanism. But today, in the interest of time, you don't want to be here all night. I'm going to just concentrate on this one particular intervention that the book makes, which is to argue that not just free African Americans were part of the movement that most historians have known now for some time, but that the enslaved themselves played a very important role in pushing forth the movement to abolish slavery. So in my book, I argue that slave resistance lay at the heart of the abolition movement, from the American Revolution to the Civil War. This is the cover of the book, and I should mention that the illustration comes from right here, the American Antiquarian Society. So slave resistance was constitutive of abolition rather than distinct from it. To read the enslaved out of the abolition movement is to profoundly miss the role that they played in shaping its protest traditions. So the actions and ideas of slave rebels and slave runaways did not lie outside of abolition, but shaped its goals. Now, the connection between slave resistance and abolition in the United States was proximate and continuous. Servant and slave rebellions paralleled and inspired pioneering anti-slavery protests by Quakers and Protestant dissenters in British North America. For the enslaved, slavery was a state of war, as it was for early Quaker abolitionists who argued that it violated their peace testimony. And here are some of these forgotten early Quaker abolitionists that we should be paying attention to. In 1737, the hunchback vegetarian Quaker dwarf, Benjamin Lay, I wonder if I point that's him, that's the only portrait we have of him, published his 271-page Philippic, All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage Apostates. Quoting scriptures as if to justify slave rebellion, he wrote, quote, "It's better to die by the sword than by famine." Now, as a God-fearing Quaker, Lay said that he would say no more, but, quote, "Notorious lies that slaves are content will never go down well," he wrote. And he literally listed the numbers of slaves that he had seen running away from slavery and slave rebellions that inspired him. Now, other preeminent Quaker abolitionists, like John Woolman, pictured there, and Anthony Benezet, pictured in the school that he opened for black children in Philadelphia, attributed their anti-slavery beliefs to the devastation wrought by the slave trade on West Africa, and to hearing first-hand accounts of the horrors of the Middle Passage. Now, it must be said that these abolitionists did not ignore African participation in the Atlantic slave trade, but they were very clear that they thought that the Africans and those who were enslaved were the real losers in this, quote, transaction. And many of them, like Woolman, actually married their anti-slavery radicalism with other causes. He pleaded the cause of the working poor. He was an environmentalist in the 18th century, right, before that became popular, talking about the devastation that the Industrial Revolution had brought in the English countryside. So most early Quaker abolitionists, many of them former indentured servants, men and women of humble origins, empathized with the plight of the enslaved. Now, anti-slavery sentiment among the handful of American colonists grew in tandem with black resistance to slavery. Puritan Judge Samuel Sewall, you'll all recognize him from the Salem witchcraft trials. He sort of redeemed himself a little bit by becoming somewhat of an abolitionist. Well, Sewall was inspired to write his anti-slavery pamphlet, The Selling of Joseph in 1700, on reading an African couple's petition for freedom. He assisted the enslaved Adams' successful freedom suit against the merchant John Saffin, who had written a pro-slavery rejoinder to this pamphlet. Now, Adams' actions, this is the slave, his actions were indicative of the various anti-slavery strategies employed by enslaved African Americans. With the help of sympathetic whites like Sewall, enslaved Africans brought freedom suits against their masters on various grounds: Christianization, verbal or written agreements, white ancestry, ill usage and brutality, or simply, the notion that their enslavement should not be lifelong or permanent, that it should have an end. Now, we need to broaden our conception of slave resistance. The enslaved's, quote, freedom claims included appropriating and critiquing law and religion as instruments of liberation. So the precedent of freedom suits, of course, continues right down to the infamous Dred Scott decision, though in that case, of course, the plaintiff was not successful. Indeed, at the very moment that English common law was being systematized, the enslaved laid claims to its notions of personal liberty and security. In Britain, runaway slaves, building on the colonial precedent of freedom suits, led Granville Sharp to apply English notions of law and liberty to Africans. And of course, Sharp was one of the leading pioneering abolitionists in Britain. James Somerset, again a slave, who had run away from his master Charles Stuart, formerly of Virginia, recruited Sharp in his quest for freedom. Stuart had also resided in Boston, and the rise in the number of freedom suits in late 18th century Massachusetts may well have influenced Somerset. In Somerset versus Stuart, the Lord Chief Justice William Murray, Earl of Mansfield, denied colonial slaveholders the right to forcibly transport their slaves out of England. The decision represented a happy marriage between slave resistance and abolitionist notions of English common law. Somerset damaged slaveholders' prerogatives and rendered the enslavement of Africans insecure in Britain. A runaway slave instigated a historic anti-slavery ruling, and it is only fitting that his name graces this landmark Anglo-American judicial decision. Now, African Americans, anti-slavery lawyers, and abolitionists would use this legal precedent to establish freedom claims in the northern states right up to the Civil War. So it was a decision made in England but had tremendous impact in the United States. Now, black people throughout the British Atlantic breathed life into the Somerset decision, or the freedom principle, celebrating it as the end of slavery in England and using it to abscond from their masters. Growing numbers of freedom suits, especially the cases of Quogue Walker and Mumbet or Elizabeth Freeman, pictured here, led to the judicial abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in 1783. And my students were always astounded when I told them that slavery ended in Massachusetts not because of any law, but because two enslaved people had chosen to sue their masters for their freedom. So it was not just Latter-day abolitionists who construed the Somerset decision and the Walker and Freeman cases as having led to the destruction of slavery. The enslaved themselves appropriated and expanded notions of legal freedom and rights. Enslaved freedom petitioners in New England not only demanded an end to slavery and compensation, but popularized the works of unknown abolitionists such as James Swan and John Allen. In 1774, Allen, in his An Oration on the Beauties of Liberty, or the Essential Rights of Americans, not only lifted the words of these freedom petitioners, but also reprinted the 1773 freedom petition of Peter Vestas, Samuel Freeman, Felix Holbrook, and Chester Joey, all slaves, who had formed themselves into, quote, an anti-slavery committee. This committee and another group, the Sons of Africa, modeled most likely after the Sons of Liberty, predated the formation of the first abolition society in Philadelphia. The Sons of Africa was the organizational moniker that Afro-British abolitionists and former slaves such as Olaudah Equiano and Atoa Pagano adopted for their anti-slave trade petitions in the 1780s and 1790s. Now, there's some controversy about Equiano. His is one of the first slave narratives that was ever published in the Anglo-American world, and there is some controversy about whether he was truthful about his birth in Africa. I think the evidence actually points to the fact that he was indeed born in Africa and that his descriptions of the slave trade were first-hand accounts of that trade. Now, the Anglo-American abolition movement got its permanent organizational expression with the formation of the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage on April 14, 1775, at the initiative of 10 Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia. And this is a fanciful 19th century rendition of that founding moment. Most of them were associates of its leading organizer, the English-born tailor Thomas Harrison. Again, humble origins, all of them working men. The society meant to help a woman of mixed Indian and African heritage from New Jersey, pictured here, interned in a workhouse, Dinah Neville. She was about to be sold into slavery with her 4 children, even though she claimed to be free. The very title of the society suggests how black efforts to gain freedom spurred abolitionist organization. The society met only 4 times that year, but it brought to court 6 cases of wrongful enslavement. Now, the American Revolution facilitated not just slave rebelliousness, but also black military action. Most used wartime disruption to simply flee. Entire families and communities, women, children, and the elderly voted with their feet against slavery. A recent estimate has scaled down the number of runaways originally proposed by Jefferson considerably, showing that at most 20,000 slaves ran away to the British, 12,000 from the southern colonies alone. Even so, historian Gary Nash has called this the largest unknown slave rebellion in American history. A rash of slave revolts and conspiracies, beginning with Tacky's revolt in Jamaica, spread through the Caribbean and the southern colonies in the 1760s and 1770s. At the end of the Revolution, thousands of black loyalists who had taken up arms responding to British offers of freedom abandoned the slaveholding republic. In their quest for freedom, they journeyed to the Caribbean, Canada, West Africa, Australia, Britain. They literally went all over the world, these black loyalists, nearly 10,000 of them. Some were literally, quote, fleeing the founding fathers, runaway slaves of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Patrick Henry. More than the American Revolution and its aftermath, which resulted in the gradual abolition of slavery in the northern states, most northern states like Pennsylvania and unlike Massachusetts passed laws gradually abolishing slavery, freeing children of slaves. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 was an abolitionist revolution. In Saint-Domingue, slave rebellion was the face of revolutionary republicanism. While some scholars still debate the contradictory effects of the Haitian Revolution, thanks to it, revolutionary resistance to slavery became a part of the abolitionist lexicon. The best exponents of revolutionary abolition were the slaves themselves, whose world historical actions forever changed the dynamic in the battle between slavery and freedom in the New World. The Haitian Revolution would inspire black resistance throughout the Americas, most notably the 1812 Aponte Rebellion in Cuba, the 1811 German Coast Rebellion in Louisiana, that was the largest slave rebellion in the history of the United States, and put abolition on the agenda of the Latin American Wars of Independence. Most Latin American countries gradually abolished slavery when they gained independence. Now, this bloody and decisive challenge to slavery and white supremacy, notwithstanding Haiti's troubled history of political instability and poverty aggravated by the policies of its erstwhile rulers and enemies, became sanctified in abolitionist memory. While much has been written about the pro-slavery response to the Haitian Revolution and the efforts of European slave-holding nations and the United States to form a sort of diplomatic cordon sanitaire around it, abolitionist reaction to it has been understudied. The commonly accepted notion that abolitionists, especially American abolitionists, distance themselves from the Haitian revolutionaries defies the historical record. This is true not just of the French abolitionists and the Société des Mines de Noir, which supported the fight for citizenship rights for free colored people and later abolition, but also of the British movement to abolish the slave trade. Thomas Clarkson, pictured here on your left, wrote one of the earliest defenses of slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue in 1792, just as the Haitian Revolution was taking off. And Haiti named one of its man of wars Wilberforce after the British abolitionist parliamentarian. Now, so Haiti, or Haitians at that time, saw themselves as part of this Atlantic abolition movement. In the United States, Abraham Bishop asked anti-slavery societies to assist the slave rebels with, quote, the pen, the tongue, the counsel, and the sword. Now, more concretely, American abolition societies, which were usually state abolition societies, like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society as the Society for the Relief of the Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, got renamed after the Revolution, and the Standing Committee of the New York Man-Commission Society, which has now gained some recognition thanks to the musical Hamilton, because Hamilton was a member of it. These societies helped fleeing Haitian slaves who were brought by their masters. They helped them gain their freedom by bringing them under the purview of their state emancipation laws. And many of these Haitian immigrants joined the abolition movement. One of them, Joseph Gassy, became one of the most successful agents of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. Now, slave rebellion spawned radical abolitionism in the Anglo-American world. In Britain, the Quaker abolitionist Elizabeth Herrick, you can see her silhouette here, unknown to most historians, coupled her call for immediate abolition with a passionate defense of the Demerara slave rebellion of 1823. And Herrick is important because she wrote a number of abolitionist pamphlets, but she is credited with being the first abolitionist to call for the immediate abolition of slavery, not for the gradual abolition of slavery, in a pamphlet in 1824 in London. And of course, she highlights the role of women, who were of course not citizens at this time and certainly did not have many rights either in Britain or the United States within the abolition movement. Now, in the United States, the free black man, David Walker, prominent black abolitionist, author of the first radical abolitionist pamphlet of the second wave, that is the frontispiece of his pamphlet, appealed to the colored citizens of the world, was probably in Charleston during the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy scare of 1822. Now, many black abolitionists in the United States in the 1820s were adopting more and more militant stances because abolition had failed in the South. In the North, in fact, you had emancipation, but in the South, you had the opposite case where slavery was growing and was an expansive institution because of the Cotton Kingdom. Now, we know of these black abolitionists because historians have pointed out that they rejected the program of the American Colonization Society, which was to free slaves and colonize them all back to Africa. It was a plan that Jefferson first touted and that became very popular amongst prominent white politicians and clergymen. Now, radical black abolitionists rejected this program, but they were also inspired by instances of slave rebellion. So Walker, for instance, called Haiti, quote, the glory of the blacks and the terror of tyrants. And in the first year of its publication, the black abolitionist newspaper, Freedom's Journal, devoted many of its pages to a history of Haiti and a glowing biography of Toussaint Louverture. Now, the decade that incubated black abolitionism ended with dramatic instances of slave rebellion. In 1831, two major slave revolts shook the foundations of Anglo-American slavery. Coming at the heels of the publication of Garrison's Liberator, Nat Turner's No Quarters Given Rebellion became irrevocably linked to the birth of radical abolitionism. And this is, of course, a contemporary depiction of Turner being discovered in the woods after his unsuccessful rebellion. Now, while slave rebellion prompted debates over emancipation in Virginia, and this is significant because most of the southern states had given up on abolition, or certainly were not debating abolition at this time, but it was Turner's rebellion that led to a debate over abolition in the Virginia state legislature. Now, that attempt to emancipate the slaves failed in Virginia, but the fact remains that it was Turner's rebellion that had acted as the inspiration for it. So now, while the attempt to free slaves failed in Virginia, excuse me, it precipitated British abolition. The charismatic Samuel Daniel Shaw, pictured here on the left, led the so-called Baptist War Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica involving nearly 60,000 slaves. Abolitionist Minister Henry Bleavy noted that the revolt and its brutal suppression dealt, quote, a death wound to colonial slavery and accelerated its destruction. 1 week after Sharp's execution in 1832, Parliament appointed a select committee to explore the expediency of, quote, effecting the extinction of slavery throughout the British dominions, unquote. Now, of course, many other factors led to British abolition in 1833. Abolitionist petition campaigns, certainly the Great Reform Act that liberalized voting to Parliament. It's always a good idea to have more voters rather than less. All that helped abolition, but Sharp's rebellion was the catalyst that precipitated it. Now, while denying charges of inciting rebellions, the pacifist Garrison clearly aligned himself with slave resistance. And this is one of my favorite portraits of Garrison because it was done by a black abolitionist artist, Robert Douglas Jr. Remarking on the suppression of Turner's rebellion, he wrote, quote, a dastardly triumph, well becoming a nation of oppressors, unquote. Now, contrary to conventional wisdom, Garrison refused to repudiate slave rebellion. He even published an imaginary dialogue between Washington and Toussaint to the former's disadvantage and a sympathetic history of Haiti, which he claimed had been so misunderstood, misrepresented, affords unanswerable evidence for immediatism. Now, Garrison never stopped praising slave rebellions, even after he adopted non-resistance, which is a radical form of pacifism that rejects the use of force, even by the state. His praise of John Brown and support for the war against slavery, again, the Civil War was a war about slavery, was no sudden turnabout. It was a long-standing position that consistently valued abolition above history's principles. Writing hagiographic biographies of slave rebels, including Louverture, Turner, and later John Brown, became a mini-industry among abolitionists, black and white, men and women. So you had somebody like the black Dr. James McCune Smith, who had to go to England, to Glasgow, to get his medical degree because no American university would admit him. Lydia Maria Child, a famous abolitionist who wrote one of the first pamphlets against racism and appeal on behalf of that class of Americans whom we call Africans. William Wells Brown, I have to see who's that, yes. Wendell Phillips, of course, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson from right here, Worcester. who could, of course, lead an all-black regiment in the Union Army. So these men and women, blacks and whites, were constantly referring to and drawing inspiration from instances of slave resistance. Now, the political significance of slave resistance in the sectional conflict over slavery is also understudied. It gave abolition its most enduring issue, the fugitive slave controversy, and provided the movement with its most dynamic exponents, fugitive slave abolitionists. Now, this was an illustration of a fugitive slave that graced American newspapers right from the colonial era right down to the Civil War. These were advertisements of runaway slaves that slaveholders put out, north and south, looking for their runaway slaves. In fact, an abolitionist, Theodore Wells, simply compiled all these advertisements and published a book called American Slavery as It Is in 1837 as an indictment of slavery, because the ads would many times have, descriptions of slaves, ears cropped off, marks on the back from lashes, just descriptions of brutality, actually, on the part of the slaveholder who was actually hunting for a runaway slave, not realizing that it gave away a picture of slavery that was not very complimentary to them. And Wells' book was indeed a bestseller in the North. Now, slave resistance revolutionized abolitionist discourse and practice and moved abolition into northern state and courthouses. Enslaved freedom seekers contributed to the breakdown of comity between the northern and the southern states. Not only did slaves run away frequently, but they displayed considerable political sophistication in discerning the social geography of slavery and freedom. Conservative estimates of around 1,000 runaway slaves per year based on US Census records, basically an official count of an illegal activity, is essentially an undercount. Today, historians argue that the number of fugitive slaves was anywhere between 150,000 to 60,000. According to a recent study, around 50,000 slaves ran away each year, but many of them remained in the South or simply absconded temporarily. Marinage within the slave South, communities of runaway slaves are called maroon communities, as in the dismal swamp between North Carolina and Virginia, a kind of inaccessible area, was also more common than previously thought. We lack figures for those who made good their escape to Mexico or to Indian Territory, or by sea to the Caribbean, and sometimes all the way to England. We may never know the exact number of fugitive slaves, many of whom were recaptured. So ubiquitous were runaways that Dr. Samuel Cartwright of Louisiana diagnosed slaves' tendency to run away as a disease. He called it exactly drapetomania. He thought, why were slaves running away? There has to be a medical reason for it. Nothing to do with slavery, of course. Now, fugitive slaves shaped abolitionist tactics and discourse. The first abolitionist petitions and letters, authored by Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and James Wharton, early black abolitionists, all concerned the fugitive slave law and the kidnapping of northern free blacks into southern slavery. With the expansion of the Cotton Kingdom, the demand for slaves was insatiable in the South. I should also mention that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were the founders of the historic AME denomination, the church that was attacked in Charleston a couple of years ago. Now, outstanding individual abolitionists, such as Quakers Isaac T. Harper, pictured on the top left, Levi Coffin, known as, quote, the president of the Underground Railroad, Thomas Garrett, who actually cooperated with Harriet Tubman in getting runaways out of Maryland and Delaware, and the Presbyterian minister, John Rankin, you can see his bust, Laura Haviland from Michigan, whose careers bridged the two waves of abolition, the revolutionary and the 19th century more radical phase, made assistance to fugitive slaves a quintessential form of abolitionist radicalism. In fact, Haviland shown here with, shackles in her hand, and a scythe actually was known to face down slave catchers and even dogs employed to remand slaves back to the South. Now, these abolitionists relied mainly on free blacks to operate the abolitionist underground for over 30 years. Intrepid men like the former slave John Parker, like the more famous Harriet Tubman, helped run up hundreds of slaves to freedom. Now, the history of the Underground Railroad, however, must rise above the story of heroic individuals or dismissed as the stuff of myth and memory. It must be placed in its proper historical context, the growth of the abolition movement. In the first 2 decades of the 19th century, Quaker abolitionists like Benjamin Lundy, who was a mentor to Garrison, and African Americans in Ohio, Baltimore, and Boston had formed, quote, humane and protection societies to help fugitive slaves and those who had been kidnapped into slavery from the North. Now, Black abolitionists established the organizational apparatus of what came to be known as the Underground Railroad, the Vigilance Committees of the 1830s. David Ruggles, pictured here with Isaac Hopper and Barney Coase of the New York Manumission Society, was the one who was most responsible for this development. He formed the New York City Committee of Vigilance in 1835, and he ran it virtually single-handedly. Calling themselves, quote, the Friends of Human Rights, the Committees of Vigilance assisted fugitive slaves and rescued kidnapped Southern and local free blacks, and those enslaved in ships involved in the illegal international slave trade, because the slave trade had been abolished by Britain and the United States in 1808, and the enslaved in ships involved in the illegal, in transit with their masters, slaves who were taken by Southern slaveholders to the North. Now, often denied legal rights by their enslavers and law enforcement officers in cahoots with them, the committee hired anti-slavery lawyers to represent African Americans caught between slavery and freedom, and successfully petitioned the New York state government for the right of trial by jury for suspected fugitives. Now, Black vigilance committees inspired by Ruggles arose all over the North. The 1837 case of Basil Dorsey, who had escaped slavery with his brothers a year earlier, led Black abolitionists like Robert Purvis, pictured there in the top middle. He was also one of the founding members of Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society, to establish the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. And these vigilance committees would, pop up all over the North in the antebellum era, even in small northern towns and cities. So you had a man who was a fugitive slave himself, Jermaine Lagoon, in Syracuse, New York, who famously said that the fugitive slave law outlaws me, and therefore I outlaw it. And he ran the Vigilance Committee in Syracuse. Here is Stephen Myers. His wife is not here, but his wife, Harriet Myers, was very active in the Albany Vigilance Committee. Lewis Hayden from the Boston Vigilance Committee, who kept a keg of gunpowder in front of his house to deter slave catchers. And of course, William Still from the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. He is famous because he wrote the first history of the Underground Railroad based on all the fugitives who came through Philadelphia. Now, grassroots activisms complemented and worked in tandem with legal and political strategies deployed by abolitionist lawyers and anti-slavery politicians. In the 1836 case, Commonwealth versus Aves, Judge Lemuel Shaw denied slaveholders the right to transit with their slaves in Massachusetts. Abolitionist Ellis Gray Loring, he's pictured here, he was a prominent abolitionist lawyer, with his co-counsel Rufus Choate, called for applying the Somerset principle to Massachusetts, especially since the case involved not just the right to transit, but residence in a free state. The Aves case, brought again by the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, involved a 6-year-old slave girl, Meg. Other northern states, after Aves moved to deny slaveholders, quote, the right to transit with their slaves. In New York, abolitionist lawyer and founder of the Liberty Party, which was an abolitionist party, Alvin Stewart, pictured here in the middle, the top, arguing for 2 black boys apprehended as fugitives, used the writ of habeas corpus to hinder recapture. So they're using all kinds of legal devices also to prevent slaveholders from recovering their slaves. In 1839, Governor William Henry Seward of New York, pictured here, he of course became Lincoln's Secretary of State, refused to extradite 3 free black seamen involved in a fugitive slave rescue to the state of Virginia. Maine turned down an extradition request from Georgia for 2 men accused of assisting runaway slaves. The Maine Anti-Slavery Society asked rhetorically if Georgians planned to invade their state and, quote, carry off the men by force, which they threatened to do. The 1837 case of Matilda Lawrence, who fled to freedom in Cincinnati with the help of a black barber and was employed by the abolitionist James Birney, became a test for establishing the freedom principle in Ohio. The state Supreme Court dropped the indictment against Birney for knowingly violating the state's law against harboring a fugitive. Now, Matilda and Birney's lawyer was the young Salmon P. Chase, who would join the Liberty Party. Though Matilda lost her dearly won freedom, Chase launched his career as, quote, the Attorney General for fugitive slaves, and he, of course, became Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury. Now, he fought many such cases whose decisions effectively nullified slaveholders' right to transit with their slaves in Ohio. Now, abolitionist challenges to the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the federal law finally reached the Supreme Court in Prigg versus Pennsylvania in 1842. Slave catcher Edward Prigg had captured Margaret, who had married a free man, and had 3 children and carried them back to Maryland without legal proceedings as required by Pennsylvania's personal liberty law. Now, Prigg and his associates were convicted of kidnapping by a grand jury, the conviction upheld by state courts. Prigg appealed his case all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice Chief Joseph Story's majority decision upheld the constitutionality of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and declared all northern state laws that contravened it unconstitutional. Now, while Story's pro-slavery decision in one fell swoop got rid of all the legal protections painstakingly won by the enslaved and their abolitionist allies, it also made recapture a federal responsibility, leaving a loophole for northern non-cooperation. His decision not only outlawed northern personal liberty laws, but also Ohio's notorious state fugitive slave law, which was promptly repealed in 1843. Now, the first fallout from Prigg occurred when suspected fugitive George Latimer was apprehended in Boston in October 1842 by a Virginia slaveholder from Norfolk and lodged in a jail to prevent, quote, a hostile crowd of blacks from rescuing him. Excuse me. Abolitionists, I think I need some water too. I have the privilege of having water and you don't. Now, abolitionists launched a massive protest campaign. A Latimer committee formed by Dr. Henry I. Bowditch and William F. Channing, among others, started publishing the first fugitive slave abolitionist paper, the Latimer Journal and North Star. And this is where Douglass got the name for his first newspaper, the North Star. A group of black men, probably the New England Freedom Association, formed by black abolitionists, stood ready to spirit Latimer away. Now, abolitionist mobilization and popular pressure achieved what legal writs failed to do. Latimer was released to the custody of his claimant, who agreed to sell him. Black custodians raised the money to buy his freedom. So you can see various strategies being employed at the same time. Street action, court cases, popular pressure. Also, unprecedented cooperation between different factions of the abolition movement, which by this time was torn between Garrisonians who believed in agitation and political abolitionists who wanted to win elections and, change the government's policy over the issue of slavery, revealed how the fugitive slave issue can unite different factions of the movement because they all came together in this case. The Latimer Great Massachusetts petition, with over 64,000 signatures, demanding a law forbidding the use of state officials and jails in fugitive slave rendition and separating the people of Massachusetts from slavery, was sent to the General Court. Another, with around 51,000 signatures, was sent to Congress, asking for the repeal of the federal law. Massachusetts' Latimer Law, as it was called, forbade the use of state facilities in fugitive slave rendition. In 1847, Pennsylvania followed suit at the height of the controversy over the expansion of slavery during the Mexican War, so it passed a new personal liberty law. Now, not just political and legal controversies provoked by fugitive slaves, two famous shipboard rebellions, one by enslaved Africans and the other by American slaves, the Amistad in 1839 and the Creole in 1841, helped spell out the significance of slave resistance in national politics and international law and diplomacy. In June 1839, Sinha or Singmi Pei, and this is a portrait of him, it was made by the brother of an abolitionist, and it was commissioned by the black abolitionist Robert Purvis. He and his comrades, part of a cargo of 53 Africans, being transported on the Shunala Amistad rose in revolt. You may have seen the movie based on this rebellion. It's not very historically accurate. Apprehended by Lieutenant Gedney on board a U.S. Navy ship, the Amistad was stowed to New London, Connecticut. Sinha and 38 adult men were indicted for murder and piracy. Local abolitionist Dwight James, who argued that the Africans, quote, had a perfect right to get their liberty by killing the crew and taking possession of the vessel, immediately alerted New York abolitionists Louis Tabot and Joshua Leavitt, who organized the Amistad Committee to, quote, receive donations, employ counsel, and for the protection and relief of the African captives. The Amistad case also united abolitionists across factional lines, with the appeals of the committee appearing regularly in Garrisonian newspapers right here in Massachusetts. Tappan was more associated with the evangelical abolitionists. Now, the Amistad Committee became a model for abolitionist committees formed to free prison abolitionists accused of assisting fugitive slaves, such as Charles Torrey, and their stories are relatively unknown. They're actually quite amazing. Torrey, of course, died in a Maryland prison. He was convicted of helping fugitive slaves. Calvin Fairbanks, who was in a Kentucky jail right up to the Civil War for assisting fugitives. Daniel Drayton, who helped a mass escape of slaves in Washington, D.C. and was imprisoned for such a long time that even after he was freed, he eventually committed suicide. He died. And then, of course, the famous case of Jonathan Walker. This is a photograph of his hand. It was branded SS for slave stealer because he helped some slaves in Florida escape. And finally, there was George Thompson, who was imprisoned in Missouri and who ended up with the Amistad Africans back in Africa in the Mendi mission that was started by them. Now, the Amistad case was tried in the U.S. Supreme Court on appeal. Tappan retained the services of John Quincy Adams as senior counsel. And Adams, of course, was known for defending abolitionist petitions in Congress against the gag rule. And, you know, he was the former president, representative from Massachusetts, not an abolitionist, but a champion of many of their causes. Now, Chief Justice Story accepted abolitionist reasoning. He argued that the Africans, quote, had been kidnapped and had a natural right to, quote, self-defense. He, however, remanded the Spanish slave Antonio back to slavery, making a distinction between the illegal African slave trade and legal slavery. Now, abolitionists, of course, made no such distinction. Antonio, with the help of Tappan and the local committee of vigilance, fled to Montreal through the Underground Railroad. Now, at the very time that the Amistad Africans were heading home, another shipboard rebellion, this time in the American brig Creole, with 135 slaves, was led by the fortuitously named Virginian slave. And this was really his name. His name was Madison Washington. Now, Washington, who had successfully escaped to Canada and was familiar with the Underground Railroad, returned to free his enslaved wife. He was captured and sold in the waterborne domestic slave trade of the United States. We know that over 1 million slaves were sold from the upper South states in Virginia to the Gulf states where the Cotton Kingdom was expanding. Washington and his men steered the Creole to Nassau, where British authorities freed the slaves and refused to extradite the 19 rebels. Around 60 boarded a ship to anonymous freedom in Jamaica. Now, the non-resistant Garrison praised, quote, the hero mutineers of the Creole, especially their leader, Madison Washington, and he called for his portrait to be placed in Washington, D.C. Of course, that went nowhere. But the Creole Rebellion led anti-slavery congressmen to not only question the pro-slavery position of the U.S. government, which demanded the extradition of the rebels, but also to defend the slaves' right to rebel. The anti-slavery Whig congressman from Ohio, one of the founders of the Republican Party in the 1850s, that's the Republican Party of the 19th century, the party of Lincoln and anti-slavery, Joshua R. Giddings, presented his famous resolutions on the Creole case in Congress on March 21st, 1842. Formulated by the abolitionist Theodore Weld, the Creole resolution asserted that slavery being, quote, an abridgment of the natural rights of man could exist only in municipal law. They further stated that the Creole rebels were not liable to quote the slave laws of Virginia and had not violated any law of the United States in presuming their natural right to liberty. Now, horrified Southerners quickly moved to censure Giddings for his support of, quote, mutiny and murder. Giddings resigned the seat and was overwhelmingly re-elected from his abolitionist constituency, the Western Reserve in Ohio. Now, anti-slavery men evoked international law against Southern slavery. In his The Duty of the Free States, or remarks suggested by the case of the Creole, William E. Channing, he wrote that the federal government could not be obligated to defend slavery, quote, in its intercourse with foreign nations. Abolitionist William J., who is pictured there, he's the son of John Jay, the founding father, argued that municipal laws that violated human rights, like slavery, were not recognized in international law or entitled to the comity of nations. Now, slave laws ceased to exist in the high seas, and slaves had the right to resist their enslavement even unto death. Now, in defending the slave's right to rebel, abolitionist legal theory made human rights an essential attribute of domestic and international law, a higher law, as it was sophistically termed, than the slave law. And this is, something that is important to note, because abolitionists were talking about human rights and resistance to unjust laws long before our 20th century conceptions of these ideas and of human rights. And long before the Nuremberg trials, and long before the United Nations Convention on Human Rights. So it is important that slave resistance is what galvanized this legal discourse. Now, many abolitionists at this time started addressing slaves directly. And this was interesting because so far they had just used instances of slave rebellion to argue for abolition, but now they started actually addressing slaves in the so-called addresses to the slaves. In 1842, Gerrit Smith, the wealthy philanthropist, proposed an address to the slaves of the United States of America on behalf of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. Smith encouraged slaves to run away and steal whatever provisions they may require to sustain themselves, and asked all abolitionists to promote the escape of slaves from, quote, their prison house. Now, Garrison also, he's always caricatured as this sort of extreme pacifist, but he also issued an address to the slaves, which he said was inspired not by the appeals, warning, rebukes, arguments, and facts of the abolitionists, but by, quote, 20,000 of your number who have successfully run away, many of them now residing in the North. Now, black abolitionists went a step further. That year, Henry Highland Garnet, we should be seeing him now, but he delineated a revolutionary plan for the overthrow of slavery in his address to the slaves delivered at the National Black Convention in Buffalo. Now, Garnet published his address with Walker's pamphlet, the Views of the Colored Citizens of the World. So he self-consciously situated himself in a distinct radical black abolitionist tradition of protest. And unlike Smith and Garrison, he contended that slaves not run away from slavery to the North, and also called a slave revolt, quote, inexpedient, as it was doomed to failure. But he recommended a general strike. Cease to labor for tyrants who will not remunerate you. So long before the fugitive slave crisis of the 1850s, which was precipitated by the passage of a new fugitive slave law of 1850, a draconian one, and the reason why that law was passed was because of these many instances of resistance. Abolitionists justified the actions of slaves who stole themselves, fought back in self-defense, and slave rebels. Slave resistance not only revolutionized the abolitionist movement, but it also had a significant impact on the national and international politics of slavery. The political significance of slave resistance complemented the simultaneous emergence of anti-slavery politics in the North, and fugitive slaves became abolition's most effective emissaries. In the 1840s and 1850s, you can't see them, a new generation of fugitive slaves, including Frederick Douglass, who I believe is doing an amazing job, and Harry Tubman, who was supposed to replace Jackson in the $20 bill, but I don't think that's happening, and Henry Craig, who published a newspaper called The Voice of the Fugitive from Canada, would jumpstart abolition and provide it with a movement literature, the fugitive slave narrative. And this is important because we were supposed to see Harriet Beecher Stowe now, but Harriet Beecher Stowe actually based her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, on many of these slave narratives. And when Southerners accused her of exaggerating or making up basically the brutalities of slavery and the slave trade, she published a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she literally listed the slave narratives that had inspired her. So the enslaved are also producing, in a way, the literature of the abolitionist movement. Now, the spectacular confrontations between fugitive slaves and their abolitionist allies and slaveholders who deployed the entire repressive machinery of the state against them in the decades before the Civil War. And again, you were supposed to see these very nice pictures of fugitive slave rebellions. You could just imagine them in Christiana, in Pennsylvania, where in fact, they killed a Maryland slaveholder attempting to recapture his slave. The Anthony Burns case, where President Franklin Pierce had to send federal troops to Boston to, render Burns back to slavery. The Joshua Glover case in Wisconsin, when the Wisconsin Supreme Court basically nullified the federal fugitive slave law, and the Oberlin Wellington Rescue in Ohio, to name just a few, builds on the legal, political, and grassroots abolitionist activism inspired by slave resistance. So this crisis of the 1850s was something that, did not just crop up. It actually had a long prehistory in abolitionist resistance to the recapture of fugitive slaves. Now, John Brown's raid into Harper's Ferry in 1859 then does not appear, it does not appear as the actions of a lone wolf abolitionist, which is the way it is commonly portrayed. Brown, who began his abolitionist career by forming an all-black League of Gileadites in Springfield, right here in Massachusetts, to resist the operation of the new fugitive slave law of 1850, was the culmination of the radicalization of American abolition by slave resistance. His prominence in both the Kansas Wars and the fugitive slave rescues signaled a militant phase in the abolitionist war against slavery, but one that was inspired by the actions of the enslaved. Brown, an admirer of the Haitian Revolution and the Jamaican Maroons, conceived of his plans to start a slave rebellion and establish a revolutionary community of escaped slaves in conjunction with black and white abolitionists. On his execution, abolitionists, even those like Douglass, who did not accompany him, and Garrison, who eschewed violent means, claimed him as one of their own. So the Civil War alliance between the enslaved, abolitionists, radical anti-slavery politicians had been long in the making. The thousands of slaves who voted with their feet and fled to Union Army lines, donned its uniform to take up arms against their enslavers, were a culmination of a long history of resisting slavery. Slave rebels and fugitive slaves had helped set in motion the emancipation of the entire race. Thank you for listening so patiently.